And then we'll let the conference room go ahead and get started when they're ready. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I think it's just, and they can hear us.
Good morning.
Hi, everyone. We're trying something new today.
Yes.
We're in a Surface Hub room, so we can draw. Can everyone see the screen? Can you guys see the?
No,
probably see us or the screen, or do you have to switch it over?
Yeah, we see you. For some reason, it does seem like the mic is further away from you. So if you are sitting in the back of the room, it would help to speak more loudly.
How about now?
Yeah, if you're speaking near the camera, we can hear you more clearly. But for the back of the room, it would help to speak loudly.
Yeah, okay. You guys might actually have to stand up.
That's fine.
It is a stand-up after all.
Oh, yeah, but yeah.
All right.
So if I speak here, can you hear it well, Ed?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Cool. All right. Bear with us. This is experimental, but we hope that this will give us a better format for doing these stand-ups because we get a whiteboard and you can actually see our faces, for better or worse.
Yep. We can see the whiteboard. Looks good.
Okay. Cool. That's good. It's alive.
It's alive.
Wow.
All right. Should we start taking questions then?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Okay. So, as usual, I guess just type them into the into the chat window. I don't know if anyone can see the chat window in here too. I guess you guys can see all the chat windows, can't you?
No, they can't.
They can't?
No.
Oh.
Well, they can in their own.
Well, on their own window, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They just can't see this one. Yeah. Okay. Is there a way to
Make it bigger?
just poking at stuff now?
You can't.
It probably looks weird from their perspective because I'm just sort of poking at nothing, right? Because they can't actually see this.
All right, so what's the first one? Is it going to be an Azure VM specifically designed for Service Fabric usage? Current SKUs tend to have low local disk space. Disappointing, the new A2V2 SKU had only 10 gigs local SSD core, which might be enough for stateless services, but not much more. So no, the answer is we're not going to have a specific one. We build on the existing ones that there are. You have to pick the ones that suit the load you're going to have. So they do have different disk sizes and they do have different capacities in terms of core counts inside them all. There isn't going to be a specific one for Service Fabric, mostly because the workloads vary so much. Anything from stateless with everything externalized to stateful, and you need more disk space. There are ones that we try and avoid, like the DS series, which is premium storage, just because they have very low disk space on them, and all of the disk effectively is, the local disk is mounted so that it is used as premium storage as a back disk for cache. So those are the ones we tend to avoid. But apart from that, it's really picking the ones that you want for your workload. Cool.
All right. What's the next question? I don't have it on here, but
You can
probably scroll it up here. Okay. What do we got?
Yeah, there are several conversations at Ignite
Windows
around
containers.
Service Fabric for Windows containers. Any updates on this? Okay, this is good. So Service Fabric is Microsoft's container orchestrator. It's the one that we built and use it a lot internally. In the 5.4 release that's coming out later this month, kind of maybe at the beginning of December, you'll see Service Fabric being integrated with Windows containers. So effectively, you can build a containerized application, post it onto Docker Hub or a private repo, and then pull down those containers. And for all intents and purposes, Service Fabric just treats services just like, or containers just like services. There are then a set of features that we make sure to make your life work well with containers. So we'll do the container port mapping to the host port mapping. And when you do that, that means we automatically register each container with a naming service. So then every container that gets deployed is discoverable, just like you'd have a service running on your machine. You can set environment variables that you can pick up inside your container. And typically you'll use those because you might set the name of one particular service in one container, like a back-end service, through an environment variable that you can pick up from a front-end container service to talk between them all. We'll also we've integrated, just yesterday we announced Azure had a repository for container repository, so you can authenticate against that. And And finally, of course, containers have a resource constraint inside them all. So that whole combination of 5.4 release means that you'll be able to take applications, deploy them, and use Service Fabric as a container orchestrator, just like you can with on Windows. This is right now. That same functionality is also in Linux side, but that's in preview mode.
All right. What's our next
I think you
question?
can get close to the screen. The mic is not picking
Oh, is it?
up.
Okay.
Yeah, you might have to come a little bit closer. so
Oh,
people
okay,
can
all
hear
right,
you.
right. That's
okay.
crowd.
Question from Gary about David Zhao's Gateway API example. Let's see, 2 things it does that the reverse proxy doesn't do. Yeah, okay, so ability to map any URL path to a service for incoming requests. So you can define mappings, which can be independent of how your application services are named. And the ability to specify what services are reachable from the outside. That's right. And let's see, both items were demonstrated on a core communication listener. And I says, I believe that item 2 and will be addressed in a future service proxy update, reverse proxy update rather.
That's a long post.
I wonder if we can get it to not stop auto scrolling. Any plans to get to where David's example is? Okay. So yeah, so there were 2 things that his does. I'm gonna use this thing. Check it out. This is great. All right, everyone knows we're welcome now.
You're not welcome.
Okay, so the first one is basically a URL routing. So rather than implement this in the reverse proxies, the reverse proxy is just it's just HTTP your cluster, and then it's app service, and that's how we figure out, and then of course your API, and that's how we figure out what service to send it to. So the question is, can I put in something custom here and create a routing table, like a mod rewrite kind of thing? And the answer is, what we're doing instead of having the reverse proxy go and do this work is we're actually doing some integration with Azure API management. If you use Azure API management, that's actually a service offered in Azure that does exactly that plus a whole lot more. So that's a different product that lets you manage your API surface area, and it gives you a portal that you can log into, set up routing rules and set up products and API access keys, all this good stuff. And it gives your developers a portal that they can log into, and they can see what APIs are available for your product. Okay, so that's a separate thing in Azure. So what we're doing is we're taking that product, and we're going to let you use that with Service Fabric. So if you have your Service Fabric cluster here, what you're going to be able to do in the same VNet is you'll be able to run API management inside of there. So API management will be able to run inside the VNet, and API management will actually have this piece that the reverse proxy has, which is the service resolution, the application service resolution. Sorry? Okay. So the service resolution that happens inside a reverse proxy today will actually live inside of API management as well. So you can use API management to do your URL routing, and then inside there it will do the service resolution, which will then actually be able to go back to your backend services, your stateful services. So it'll be kind of a combination of what API management does today, in addition to what reverse proxy does today. And so that's kind of the plan for that. Then the second question was about will the reverse proxy. Thanks, John. makes my voice sound bigger with an echo. The second question was if reverse proxy will allow you to select which services you want to expose outside the cluster. So today, reverse proxy, when you turn it on and if you expose the port out through the load balancer, all of your services are now exposed to the internet, which is obviously a bad thing. We don't recommend you do it. One of the features we're adding in the next couple of releases will be a whitelisting feature. So you get to decide through a configuration which services are actually exposed out through it. So you can say, I only want my web-facing services exposed to the reverse proxy and everything else is hidden. So we're adding that to reverse proxy, but the URL management part will come through API management. All right.
Comprehensive answer.
With pictures.
Yeah, pictures. Okay, what's the current support statement for Windows 2016 for Service Fabric? It's supported.
All right, that was easy.
You can build clusters with Service Fabric Windows Server 2016, and it's a supported OS.
It's not in the portal yet, though, right?
It's just not in the portal yet. So you have to do it through ARM. So yeah, that's a good point. And of course, if you want to use container support, you have to use that one anyway. What's the latest update on Docker support in Service Fabric? I have an immediate need to support workloads in this hybrid compute scenario. I think I mentioned that just now. So it will, in the 5.4 release that comes out, you'll have full container support for the ability to activate containers inside your cluster as like services effectively. And you'll see the equivalent on the Linux side. So you can go there and effectively launch Docker containers there. So as I mentioned before, Service Fabric is Microsoft's container orchestrator, and we're going to make sure it's the best container orchestration platform for Windows and for Linux. There's the next question here on actors.
Can you read it for me?
I want to know what the future plans were with respect to Service Fabric actors. Specific things I'm interested in are inversion of control and easier testability. Also, better support for fire and forget messaging actions without having to see reminders.
Let's see if this works.
There we go.
There you go. Okay, so the question is, okay, so with IOC and testability, I'd be curious to know specifically what you're having trouble with regarding IOC and testability. We added a few things over our last couple of releases that should have made this a little bit easier. That lets you do a dependency injection of all the platform dependencies. So the things that your actor class depends on that you weren't able to mock out before, like actor ID and the actor service and state manager, that stuff's all mockable now because the actor service actually holds most of that, and that's injectable into your actor through the constructor. So you should be able to mock all that stuff out and do testing that way. Maybe if you want to elaborate a little bit on where you're still having trouble, that would be helpful, and we can check that out.
Are you able to hear me okay?
I can hear you, yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, that was cool. We saw that. We changed all our tests for that. We had to make like a lot of fakes to support that before. We still kept our fakes, and that's cool. That's forward momentum there.
Yeah.
One of the things though that we still lack is we have our own dependencies that we want to inject into actors, and in order to do that and properly clean up things with lifetime scope, we basically made our own like base actor. We just call it company name actor basically, right? And we had to wire up a lot of stuff that just felt kind of gross to handle a lot of that story, like a lot of weird delegates that we just felt really should have been handled as part of the framework there. That's more what I'm speaking to. But yeah, there's definitely forward momentum going there with the Service Fabric dependencies. But,
yes, that's right.
I'm more worried about our dependencies now.
Yeah, that was mainly our goal, was to make those mockable, because without being able to do that, you were basically stuck. So we kind of, the philosophy we took with services and actors was that we give you a way to at least inject things through your constructor, so you at least have a way to get things in there. And then we didn't make a decision on what IOC container we want to use. So we didn't actually include an IOC container or anything like that, or specific support for one. So that's sort of an exercise we left out to the users to actually do the lifetime management of your dependencies. We may come back and take a closer look at helping out with that a little more. The way that now that ASP.NET Core kind of led the way there. They had their own dependency injection framework, and it was under that Microsoft Extensions dependency injection that they added. So we may look at see what they did and see if we can add a little bit more in that regard. But for now, it's still kind of an exercise left with the user. Yeah.
Too many details for a conversation this big, but if I actually live in Redmond, I'd totally be willing to show you guys what we're doing, just so that you can see the pain we're suffering and see if maybe there's a better way to.
Please come on over.
We meet people almost hourly, so yes, feel free to do it anytime you want.
All right, stay on the line after the call, and we'll get in touch, and then we'll invite you over sometime. Sound good?
No, that actually sounds amazing. No, not even good.
We'll have appetizers and everything.
Yeah,
spread out.
Yeah. Okay. Just hang out for a little bit after the call, and we'll get in touch with you. Okay. Let's move on for now. What was the next question?
The next question was: is there also any news on moving the framework to .NET 4.6 Plus or the VM images?
So the server 2016 images should come with 4.6.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever went back to 2012 R2. They have 4.6 now?
Yeah.
Do they? Okay.
Yeah, they were upgraded about a month ago.
Oh, about a month ago. Okay.
So all your images use 4.6?
I'm using it successfully. If you just change your project type from 5. Or Yeah.
Yeah,
452 to 6.1, it'll work fine.
Okay. The next one is centralized image store.
Another aspect that Sergey is also bringing up is with actor messaging. Currently, if I want to send a message from actor to actor, I have to wait for the completion of its handling. If I want to do fire and forget style messaging with a guarantee that the message was actually sent, I have to use actor reminders, which it works. It's kind of disgusting. People don't like typing it, right? It's not a very good developer experience. We're about to write some infrastructure to make that easier, but if you guys have some secret sauce coming out, we will obviously not have to do that work. So I just want to see if there's anything coming there.
So we've talked a little bit about coming up with a pub sub mechanism that you can run inside a cluster, something kind of maybe sort of similar to Service Bus, but running inside your cluster. It would be an external mechanism from that might give you messaging. The way that the actor's communication works, it's actually just RPC, the same way that remoting works, right? So you're just making remote procedure calls. They happen to use TPL, and you get asynchronous operations, but it's not actually sending a message into an inbox and then returning right away. You're actually making an RPC call. So yeah. If you want to do some sort of asynchronous messaging, that's something you have to invent on your own or use reminders like you did. But we're looking at doing some kind of external pub sub mechanism, hopefully to make that easier.
Come on, Jocko, don't be shy.
Come on in, Jocko.
So the next one,
You're on camera though. So.
The next one is centralized image store. Is there such a thing? How would it be set up, and what are the advantages? So when you talk about image store here, are you talking about container images, or are we talking about service packages?
Service fabric image store?
There's two things here, I guess. One is yesterday.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can
Yes,
hear you.
we can hear you.
You're live on the air.
All right. So what we're looking at is we're just getting our feet wet with deploying a stateful microservice in a on-prem cluster. So when we're deploying a packaged image, it goes to an image store per cluster. And then as I'm going to move from one cluster to the next, I have a dev test cluster, a UAT cluster, and then a production cluster. Moving that image across multiple image stores seems, if that's the way to do it, that's the way to do it. I'm just looking for some guidance, and I didn't know if there was something like, like Docker Hub, where you upload the image to a centralized location, and then you can pull that image from any of the clusters.
I think that you're mixing two things together, right? So I think one thing it's important that your config management in terms of what images are deployed to each cluster is very important to keep track of. So that is one aspect to this. So using our own internal image store for artifacts you deploy into the cluster makes sense to have per cluster. The second point which you brought up is, where do I really store my source of truth, which I'm deploying to multiple places? You certainly can use GitHub. You can use any other external image store if you want. I thought that what you were asking was slightly different, where you were trying to use containers or any of those heavy,
like a service registry.
Yeah, or the service registry.
Like Docker Hub or something.
Yeah. So if that were the case, then if there is a specific need for it, actually send us that particular requirement, and then maybe we can try to accommodate.
Yeah. Well, that is something we thought about in the past too. Is a service registry, kind of like Docker Hub, a place where you can send compiled application packages or service packages. Yeah, and be able to just pull those down and then deploy them to your cluster. That's kind of what you're thinking of, right? Because the image store.
Right.
Well,
that's exactly
pull
what
them
I was
down on demand into the cluster, or exactly right.
Yeah.
So let me sort of expand a little bit, and I'll try to be quick. Is that what I'm wondering is, so for example, I'm going to have a package that goes out with an application config that is for my dev environment, and I'll have an application that goes out for my test environment. Those would be two different images that are uploaded to my image store. I'm wondering, that's sort of the second piece of my question here, is can I do that? Can I deploy multiple versions of the same application in the same hardware on-prem cluster? Or do I really need to build a dev cluster and a test cluster?
You can have separate app
I mean,
types.
you could totally deploy multiple instances of the same app type, different versions, all in the same cluster. That said, there's a lot of goodness behind having different environments just as a kind of best practice thing. You're not required to, by any means. Feel free to cram it all into one cluster. But a lot of people like to separate it because, secrets are different. Their deployment cadence might be different. If you deploy some absolute garbage that makes it into the test environment, you don't necessarily want it to impact running production environments, that sort of stuff. But there's nothing from Service Fabric side that enforces that, Phil, so feel free to mix and match.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, you guys answered the question. It was more along the lines of, is there something like what you do for containers for applications? And the answer seems to be like, no, you have some sort of source control, which is fine. But as far as that goes, there's going to be one image store per cluster, and that's the way to go.
Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, where do we get to? So I think the one after that was, is there anything on the roadmap to run a cluster across data centers? Oh, sorry, I missed one.
Linux container support, .NET Core. Will Linux container support .NET Core 1.1?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
if you're running in a container,
I think it's more about, will there be .NET Core 1.1 on Linux? And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Can you put that inside a Linux container? Yes.
Sure. Yep.
And will we support Linux containers? Yes.
Already do, in fact.
We already do. Yeah. Although Linux on Service Fabric is preview, and it won't GA until next year.
But short answer, yes.
So,
Yes.
.NET Core all the way.
But just be aware about the runtime, right? The Service Fabric runtime. Yeah, well, what we're talking about there is guest containers. So take a .NET Core application, package it as a container that doesn't have any Service Fabric pieces in it, and you can orchestrate it. We don't yet have support for running like a Service Fabric stateful service on .NET Core inside a container on Linux.
Correct.
Or Windows for that matter.
There are a few REST APIs to do health reporting, but it's not the full breadth of what you might need.
All right, next question is, in reliable services, is pipelining or awaiting multiple concurrent collection operations within a single transaction supported? No, that's not supported. And you'll get that, actually, I think you mentioned here, that invalid operation exception. We throw that deliberately if you try to do if you try to, say, kick off multiple asynchronous operations on reliable collections within a transaction and then task win all. If you try to do that, we'll deliberately throw a invalid operation exception. So that's not allowed. Okay, next question. I think this one's for you, Jaco. Is there anything on the roadmap to make a secure cluster easy to deploy via the portal or ARM template?
Oh, good.
That's for you, Bob.
Plant in the audience.
Yes.
So I'm assuming none of us wrote that question.
Your check is in the mail, whoever you are. Yeah.
So yes, there's something which we're actively working on. There are some basics which we can't get around too quickly. One, basically, we will have to use Keyboard. You will have to upload a certificate to Keyboard. Those are two things which we can have scripts on. We can try to shield that away by providing you a single command and so forth. Those are the things we're trying. We're also talking to the Keyboard team if we can get Keyboard and the certificates in them be a proper ARM resource. If that were the case, then basically we can describe it in the ARM resource like we do a VM, and that will be far simpler. So that's something coming up for the next year. But till then, at least this year, our aim is to give you a seamless, or so-called seamless, one script which will do this for you, and that will be a part of what comes out of the product itself rather than a small script in my GitHub. So that's something which is coming. So yes, this is a problem we are actively looking at just to solve.
All right. Next is an enhanced migration path or a wizard or a process from cloud services to Service Fabric. So we have guidance up that we posted, which you've probably already seen, but maybe Sean can confirm, but we don't have any plans to actually set up a wizard-like experience that'll automatically migrate cloud services to Service Fabric. They're just a little bit too different to be able to do that, I think, successfully in all cases.
Yeah, those wizards tend to work well for demos, but for real applications break down pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But we're definitely curious to hear, and maybe people can just add comments in the guidance, like as comments on the guidance documentation of, have you tried it? What things have you run into that have been challenging? Because we want to try to refine that more. Our worry is that people are kind of waiting for this sort of wizard-like one-click experience that is we're not planning to deliver. And so we want to hear from people that are actually trying to do that migration and make sure that we've got things covered. So we think it's actually pretty straightforward. And I guess the other thing I'll say is we've heard from customers who get a little bit overwhelmed thinking that by virtue of moving from cloud services to Service Fabric, they need to completely re-architect their application. And now all of a sudden they have to do microservices, and now they have to do stateful services and take advantage of all the additional power that Service Fabric gives them, which you do not. You can do a fairly straightforward migration from, say, your worker roles into stateless services and your web roles either into self-hosted ASP.NET Core services, or what some people do is take the opportunity to move that web tier into an app service. So those are kind of two options, but there is that fairly straightforward migration path that you can then down the line decide if you want to think about re-architecting your application and taking advantage of stateful services or some of those other things. But don't be overwhelmed by the possibilities just in terms of getting started.
Okay, so the next one. Is there a guideline about the amount of data that can be stored in reliable collections? And is it recommended to use it as a primary storage for application data?
So there's no specific limit or reference because we just use the storage in terms of memory and disk that's available in your cluster. So the total amount of data is going to be capped kind of at that, multiplied by the number of replicas you have, the number of partitions, overhead of your application packages, all this type of stuff. There's no hard limit on the amount. There are some pieces of guidance that we do give you, though, around how to think about the data that you're storing inside of the collections. The first thing is, yes, absolutely, you can use it as the primary store for application state. Lots of people do that, and that's recommended if you are trying to get away from a big bulky data store in the back, for example. Not everybody has to do that, but you certainly can. The second thing is just that, typically when you're updating the collections, we prefer, or you should prefer making those updates as small as possible. So I wouldn't, if you had a gig of state overall that you wanted to store inside a whole bunch of dictionaries, that's totally fine. I wouldn't store it as one key with one 1 gigabyte value, because then any single time you touch that value, you're replicating a gigabyte of state all at the same time, right? Which is no good. You'd want to break that up, or think of some other way of segmenting that state into many keys and many values. Ideally, that they're fairly small, so that when you make changes, you're making them in a granular sort of way. That's just because all these types of state changes do go across the network, right? And if you had a whole bunch of 1 byte values, then the overhead of sending the messages starts to become significant. And if you have a whole bunch of 1 gigabyte values, well, then you're buffering 1 gigabyte of stuff in memory and then trying to send it all across the wire at once. And if that fails, then you have to retry it. And it just, you really start to fight the properties of most networks when you're doing that. So that's kind of all that we generally have to say about it is, just be aware that this is a replicated operation when you're writing things into the collections. And that, you're really talking about, think about if you were sending something over the network, what properties would you like it to have? How big would you want it to be? That type of thing. And that's the same types of restrictions that you should put on the operations that you do on the collections.
There's also guidance around costs, too. So we usually tell people, if you're storing state in reliable collections, you're paying compute costs to store that state. You're essentially using compute VMs to store state instead of using storage mechanisms, storage accounts, which are a lot cheaper to store state. So one of the ways you can think about it when you're thinking about how much data should I actually put in the reliable collections, think about how many VMs do I need to actually run my workload. Okay, say you need 10 VMs to run whatever workload you have to handle all your requests. Yeah, just in terms of compute power. Yeah. Exactly, right. And then think, well, so as long as I already have these VMs, they have these disks, and so I should use those disks that are on there to store additional state on there, which is great, because then you don't actually pay any additional cost to store that state. Now, if the amount of data you want to store goes beyond the number of VMs you need to run your compute workloads, now you're in this territory where, well, maybe you're not being cost effective anymore because you're just using compute VMs to store data now, which probably isn't so good.
Are you telling me I shouldn't be replicating entire MP4 movies as a part in my reliable collections?
That's right, Matt.
Oh, wow. Too late. Too late. Yeah, darn, I already did that
Well,
once.
I'll take those servers down.
Yeah. So it's things like that.
Yeah.
It's your hot state. Right?
It's your hot state,
Right.
exactly. Right, yeah. And there's actually a common pattern that we have where it's you have some set of hot state that your users are accessing constantly, and then you may have a whole boatload of cold state, like say you have an IoT application where you have device data streaming in, and you want to keep a history of all the event streams that come in, but your users usually don't look at that. They just want to run some analytics on it or some processing or something. Over the last like maybe few minutes of data. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe your users only care about the last few minutes of data. They just want to see what's the current state of my warehouse right now. Is it on fire or not? Something like that. But if they want to ask questions like, has it been on fire over the last 5 months?
Or how many times?
Or how many times has it been on fire? That data is better stored in some cold offline storage, like cold blob storage, which is a lot cheaper than storing it in VMs. So usually they'll do an event streaming thing where I keep the most recent few and then everything else I offload somewhere else. So that's essentially what it is, because the amount of state you can store is really limited by what your compute VMs can hold in terms of their disk size and their memory size. So just keep that in mind when you're making those decisions.
Okay, Windows Update. This is for you, Jacko. How can the VM in a cluster keep up to date in regards to Windows Update?
Okay, so
And update.
You get all the hard
I got all the
Just a painful one.
Yeah.
all the fun ones. Looks like I'm getting all the fun ones which Service Fabric doesn't control by itself. So we rely on infrastructure for all these things. So one of the big problems which you are asking about is how do I keep my VM operating system updated? So there is a script which you're working on, which we will most probably release in December, which will allow you to keep it updated, basically just patched. That will be based on Windows Update. So till then, you have to do it manually, very slowly, one VM at a time. I know it is not something which you can operationalize, but the script is coming out soon. We're working on it. We are in the process of testing it. So once that comes, then basically we'll have a documentation on how to use that. And then long term, maybe in the Q2 timeframe, basically we would have a feature which is built by our lower level infrastructure managers, which would allow you to do image-based patching. So very similar to what you have in cloud services, where basically when you come to ARM and say I need the latest definitions of a given operating system, then that particular patch of your OS itself is managed centrally and you don't have to worry about it. Till then it is a painful exercise. We realize that we're working on it at this point.
I think it says it somewhere inside here, doesn't it?
What is it?
Is this where you talk about upgrades inside this article or not? Oh, don't worry.
Yeah,
Could I ask a follow-up question on that?
Yes, please.
I think in the documentation that you have out there, you mentioned that you're planning it to. I don't know if it was put it together with the Windows patches. I'm thinking about upgrades in the sense of, are you going to be upgrading both the cluster and Windows with the same patch, or is it just to allow the Windows patching to occur on the service and then the cluster upgrade would be separate?
So two things. So yes, so they would be separate. So whenever you say a cluster upgrade, I'm assuming it is the Service Fabric version which you're talking about. That actually is a very distinct step. Today you have a way to do it, whether you can set your cluster up for management, as automatic or manual, and that is distinct from what operating system patches are. We do not send our patches through WU, so basically operating system patches does not mean that the Service Fabric versions get patched. So OS would be a separate one, and that's the one which I was talking about, which actually is something we're working on to make it better.
Gotcha, thank you.
So the next one is cluster capacity planning. What can and cannot be changed after initial setup? Add resources to an existing VM, add VMs to an existing cluster.
Sorry, these are some unorganized notes that I've been taking over the last couple of weeks, so I can actually maybe speak to the question a little bit more. I heard, there's some things it seems like that are dynamic that you can add to the cluster after it's been created, and then I've heard of other things that it seems like, based upon the November 2nd training that you guys did, that when you set it up, if you want to change this on the cluster, it's pretty much a tear down and recreate of the cluster. Is there any place where I can read up on to find out exactly, when you're doing your cluster capacity planning, these are the things that once you get up, you can't change?
So two things which you have to, two very uber things at a very high level. If you set up an unsecure cluster, you can't move to being a secure cluster. That's very clear. And vice versa. If you have a secure cluster, you can't go to an unsecure cluster. So that's the top number one.
But you should never do that anyway.
Yeah,
right?
You should never do that anyway. And we are actively working on removing the ability for you to deploy unsecure clusters
while making the secure ones much easier. Right?
Yes. Oh, yes, thank you.
Right.
So second piece of it is till we reach a point where we are able to give you a durability value of silver or gold. Gold is available now; it's very expensive. So silver that applies to every SKU. Changing the VM size. Basically, say for example, you initially selected D1s, and then you decide, no, for this particular node type, I want it to be D4. That actually today is not a very safe operation. Safe in the sense that you have a good likelihood of losing data. So if you're stateless, then you will not care. But if otherwise, except for the primary node type, you can change the other ones. So that will be another thing which you should be very careful on. The third one is the primary node type itself. If you choose a primary node type, you can't change the VM SKU for it at this point. Later on, maybe early next year, you will be able to do that safely.
I mean, you can't change the VM size.
VM size is a very big deal.
But adding and removing nodes is still fun.
Yes, you can add or remove nodes up to the reliability value from a primary node type. From the secondary node type, you can reduce that all the way to 1.
So in my scenario here, again, I'm on an on-prem cluster. So if I were to add more RAM or more CPUs to the VM itself, would that cause a problem? And if I added more VMs to the existing cluster, would that cause a problem?
So on-prem is a different animal altogether. So my whole answer and question
I know, I try to...
These are all specific.
On-prem, you can do whatever you want.
No, you have to do them safely. So that is the key, right?
So the certificate thing still holds.
Yeah, certificate thing still holds.
Can't go from unsecured to secured.
So now let's talk about adding new memory to it. Yes, you can actually get a machine down. You can actually safely shut the machine down. I actually, somewhere in my upgrades, I talk about how to shut a machine down, how to gracefully shut the node down and then the machine down. Once the machine goes down, you actually can change the CPU, put a new machine, and give it the same identity. We don't care.
All it needs is an operating system, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what the hardware is underneath.
Yeah. So it doesn't. You can add new RAM to it. You can change the CPU, come back, but as long as the node identity is the same. Basically, so for on-prem, it will be the same IP addresses have to come. We don't check its IMEI or any of those specific things, manufacturing things. So as long as that particular machine has the same IP address, we treat them as the same node. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, it does. The last thing on that was the third piece of the November 2nd training. Do you guys know if that's been posted online? I couldn't find it like a week later. I don't know if that's
coming. It's being in post-production, and they take a while, it seems. I'm pretty sure Heishi said it'll be next week, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So the next question is, anything on the roadmap for cluster across data centers within a region? Within a region.
So within a region, you do have... So availability is so stepping back. So today there are two concepts which I think even our internal customers get confused. One is availability sets. So availability sets, basically today you do get all your VMs in Azure striped across FTs and UDs. That means they are across racks and then logical units of hardware. Then now there is a new concept which is going to come out, which says that you actually can have a deployment which goes across multiple fabric controllers, or you can say multiple buildings. Think about multiple buildings. So you'll have some VMs in one building, the second will be the second AZ, and so we will start to support that pretty soon. So to answer that question is, in a region, yes, we would actually give you supports for AZs.
And that's called
availability zones.
Zone, right.
If you are reading up on AWS, availability zones there are slightly different from AZs as is defined in Azure. Azure just basically means that you're across two buildings, and there are enough safeguards between the buildings and redundancies between the buildings that if a building is gone, it doesn't affect you on the other end. So we will do that. And then before anyone asks, let me also tell you about cross-regional. So this is something which Matt and I have been working with the networking team for some time. So we have some incubations going on. We still are not at a point where we believe that we can publicly claim that we can do a cross-regional cluster. So this is something which we are working on. We believe that maybe in early next year or so, we should be able to come out and have a statement.
Yeah, and just to flesh that out a little bit, I mean, the situation is Service Fabric is perfectly capable of running across regions. We have customers that do this today inside of Microsoft. What we're really working on is making sure that experience works well for you, the customer, when you do it inside of Azure. And there's a few things that, networking might work today. There's ways to set it up, but it's a little bit fragile. It's a little bit complicated. And then when you get to the actual operational aspect of things, like where do the traces go? How do you monitor this thing? What region is it in from the perspective of Azure? How do I manage it? Those are the questions that we're working on getting better answers for and making sure that those experiences work well before we're going to have any sort of supported or production-ready template that shows you how to do that. So we're very aware that this is a big ask. A lot of customers are looking for this type of thing, but it's just not quite ready for prime time yet. The underlying technology is there. It's getting the actual management experience kind of done in a way that will make sense and work well.
So if you are an on-prem customer and you have good network which you have leased from any of the backbone providers, you can do a cross-regional cluster today.
Okay, let's move on.
Next question is there a roadmap to run microservices developed in Java and other languages in SF? So yes, absolutely. Today you can actually run services in any language at all if you host them as a guest executable, meaning you're not using our reliable services APIs. So you can already use any language you want today. You just have sort of a subset of the features available on the platform. But we do plan on doing first-class support for other languages as well. So we do have Java available today if you're running on Linux. We hope to bring Java to Windows as well. That shouldn't really be a problem for us. And then beyond that, we're also looking at other languages. No specifics on what those languages will be, but we do want to make it at least easy enough to bring other languages with first-class support for Service Fabric features. So that's something that's on the roadmap, definitely. All right, what do we got next? The right way, yes, to suspend a complete cluster so compute charges are not incurred.
Okay, there actually is no right way to do this. So you would be paying for compute charges for every VM which you use, and the minimum for primary node type depends on your reliability value. So for a production cluster it would be 5, and for test it would be 3. There is really no safe way to shut down a VM and bring your cluster back up when you want it. So that actually is the truth.
You can do one. You can shut down a given VM, but there's no way to do it for the whole cluster. You can't suspend the whole cluster in some safe way.
You can get it down to the reliability value.
Right.
So that's the least you can get.
So the recommendation is for your test clusters, if you're really concerned about cost, is just to stand them up on demand as part of your CI flow, right? So you run a build, you want to test that build, set up an ARM template that stands up your test cluster, deploy your application, run your tests, tear down the cluster.
And then there are scripts available. You can use your ARM templates for it. And then CI/CD pipeline is the best way to do that for test purposes.
All right, next question is about Service Fabric Lab. Where's part 2? Todd, where's part 2?
Still being worked on. Maybe the first week of December.
All right.
We just recently updated Lab 1, by the way. We should repost it so people can find it. And it's just if people want to find Lab 1, it's on our Service Fabric team blog, and it's there.
You can actually pull it up. Okay. So that's coming. Still a problem testing of deployment SF on-premises on physical Windows Server 2016 RTM nodes. And there's an error, so there's no access to Fabric root folder. Any ideas?
I don't have an idea from here at this point. I would just say file a service or
support ticket,
and then we'll follow up.
Or ask on Stack Overflow and get to it as we get to it.
Yes, ask on Stack Overflow.
But I mean, that just sounds like a standard permissions issue, right? I mean,
it looks like it.
You make sure that whoever you're executing this thing as has permission to write to wherever it's trying to save, or I think you can specify the SF default directory. So if you put it to something you know you have control over, maybe that would be a way of troubleshooting, but that's about the best we can tell you without having a deeper look at it.
What's the next one?
Patching upgrades. Yep.
Okay, so I think that's
a sort of a follow-up on what you guys had earlier. The Windows patches and the cluster upgrade are definitely going to be separate, but we have scheduled downtimes when we do our Windows patches. What I'm wondering is if maybe I can kick off a PowerShell script from SCCM to do the upgrade, so then we can do our verification afterwards, or something like that. I'm trying to envision how I'm going to patch during my downtime with my cluster and my Windows OS. Is that a decent approach that I should continue to look into?
I think you should, but what happens is, so you can use SCCM to schedule all these things. That's certainly you can do. The key about this one is OS patches happen monthly on Patch Tuesdays and so forth. So you can actually think in terms of windows, unless you have a window every week. Otherwise, I would say that you don't really need to have a window for Service Fabric patches. You can do them on a live cluster.
My boss will not. That's not going to fly.
So then,
I need to have verification afterwards.
Okay. So the best practice we always tell is you should have a watchdog and watchdogs which are working on verification of how your application is performing at all times. So if you already have it, then it's only a question of time before your boss agrees that it's okay. Till then, have a window where you are not having your applications on, and that is,
don't know another way out.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, now, I guess one thing, and I think I saw you when you at Ignite, I think you mentioned this, is that you can have Service Fabric download and have the patch, the cluster upgrade package available, and just sitting there waiting for you to say, go ahead and do it. So I was thinking, have SCCM, figure out how to script out the go ahead and do it from PowerShell, and then have SCCM call that script when we're down in an outage. Is that a decent approach?
That is a perfectly fine approach.
Awesome. Thank you.
That's the way to do it.
All right, next question is about 5.4, and I think Mark already answered that in the comments. That will be available come December. 5.4 will be available in December.
So actually, one more question one more answer for Greg. He didn't ask that question. So if you have any virus scan tools or any of those things, I would say that you should exclude certain directories. And I think I have documentation as to what are the ones you are excluding. So that's something which I've seen on-prem customers hit very repeatedly, that they have third-party tools which interact or affect our performance in terms of service fabric runtime.
Okay, I'll try to look for that. Thank you.
All right. Let's see. This question here. Can we run Node.js services on SF clusters without packaging it as a guest executable? Not today. Mark, you already answered this. Yeah, Mark is right. That has to be a guest executable today. Whether or not we're going to provide first-class support for Node.js, it's something we're thinking about, but we don't have any concrete plans on when or how that will be available. But we're definitely thinking about it. We know how popular Node.js is, so we're looking at that.
Can I also ask another question related to that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so many times, this is a customer actually, they're trying to do their Node.js implementation on Service Fabric. One of the things they're running into is the Windows file naming convention and directory length. So because of so many packages that they have included, very often we run into that 256 character limit. So is there a workaround? Is there something that we can say that you're recursively using packages, cut it down? I mean, it's kind of become a very painful process.
So in Windows today, that limit is going away. I think in 2016 they finally got it sorted out. So if it's just a standard Windows executable, like you're running this node thing, if there's support for changing it to the Unicode paths, or it's like // question mark and then go, then Windows does support that. There are places in the ecosystem overall that either aren't using Unicode paths. This application that you're talking about might be one of them. .NET itself has had problems with this historically, though there's ways to turn it on and enable it, starting, I believe, in .NET 4.6. So it should be doable, but you'd have to find all the places where the standard pathing is being used and replace those with the Unicode path structure. It's a little gross, but it is present on Windows today. Other than that, I don't think that there's a good way that I know of to just remove the max path limit.
You can map that particular directory to a new drive.
You can do that. That's one way to do it. We have seen issues with that as well, right? I mean, sometimes those links don't work quite the way you'd expect them to within the file system.
Sure, thank you. So how about running this on a Linux Service Fabric cluster?
Sure.
Yeah, go for it. Yes, you can do it. That. I mean,
knock yourself out. It's in preview, but you can definitely do it.
And I don't think .NET Core suffers from this, is it?
Well, the long path.
Yeah.
It did. Everything suffers from it because if your paths are too long. .NET Core is kind of the same problem because they pull in packages for everything. But they've managed to kind of flatten it out. Yeah. So we used to have a really big problem with ASP.NET Core path too long exceptions, if you remember this. And that was because you have these directories within directories within directories that have packages, NuGet packages that make up the .NET Core runtime. And so they managed to flatten their directory structure out so that you don't run into these path too long exceptions. But again, it's a Windows thing, which apparently is going to be fixed in 2016, Server 2016. So hopefully the problem will just go away on its own there. But yeah, you can do it on Linux.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Hey, Matt, I got one for you.
Okay.
This is for Mads. With full container support, do you plan to make Service Fabric the, quote, fourth orchestrator with ACS to emphasize the container orchestration capabilities, or will it continue to be separate?
Man, I think we want to.
I just replied to this, actually.
Yeah.
So the way to think about it is Service Fabric is Microsoft's container orchestrator. Up until now, it's orchestrated processes, and it's spent years and years and years making processes work very well. And now you have containers, we throw that one into the mix.
Yeah, it should be an option alongside.
But that's ultimately just a positioning question. It's not, doesn't change the technology at all, right?
Yes.
Because ultimately ACS at this point is just a way of standing up an environment based on one of those third-party orchestrators. So if we put it under, think about it as just being like under the ACS drop-down in the portal kind of thing. Like it wouldn't change anything.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Do you support full Docker support for both Windows and Linux? And for Windows, there's only Windows 2016. Yes. So for Windows, only Windows 2016.
I replied to this one.
You did. Okay.
Yes.
Mark is just ahead of the game here. We can all just leave, I guess.
He got four good answers. Should have decided to read ahead.
All right. We got like 10 minutes.
What's the next one, Mark?
Okay.
I don't know.
What would be
Why is IAC requires a marker interface?
Where do you see that?
Down for
Yeah, I got it. So,
there it is. Yeah.
So the iActor interface is our marker that we use to decide what interfaces you want to actually remote. You might have interfaces on that service that are not intended to be exposed.
You mean methods on the interface?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or entire interfaces, right?
Okay.
Because that gets its inheritance, right? Sure. So we will only remote the ones that you mark. So now the other question is, the other thing that marker does, is that there are certain requirements that we have on the interfaces that we remote, and that interface tells us which interfaces to go look at, and then which ones to scan and make sure that those rules apply. So we have to check make sure that it is remoting on the client side so that you can create an actor proxy on it. It has to be sure that it returns tasks. Those types of checks are all the types of things that we have to do, and that marker tells us which ones to go inspect. It is a little bit kludgy. We understand the feedback. It might move to something aspect-based in the future or something like that, but there's really no way to get away from the problem of having to know what to remote and then needing to be able to somehow validate that interface respects the requirements for remoting.
I think the next one in the list is what would be the key themes for choosing Service Fabric versus Azure Container Service versus Kubernetes when deploying containerized microservices? When should we choose to use one over the other? I think the clear thing that is there today is that all of the ones you talk about in Azure Container Service are all Linux-based. They're based on open source technologies. We're very keen to support as many of those different types of container orchestrators as we can on Azure, and we'll probably be adding more of those as they evolve. You might see many of them inside there. And from a Linux perspective, that's very, the Azure Container Service is very Linux-based today, and they'll slowly drift over to the Windows side. I think if you come from a Windows background or perspective, Service Fabric would be the one that you choose as the container orchestrator of choice first. And of course, then we're going into the Linux side. And then it's just a matter of where you think your preferences are. If there are some particular open source technologies you want to use and take advantage of those, Azure Container Service is a great way to go. On the Service Fabric side, it's more of an integrated offering that goes from a stack right from container orchestration up to our very productive programming models. And you may choose that the combination of those fits your scenario a bit more. Certainly on the Service Fabric side, we think about how you can combine containers and executables and our programming models and put those all together and choose whatever you want. On the Azure Container Service side, it's more, build your own. Next.
So where are we here?
How do we deploy a single microservice?
I answered that.
Okay. Common practice profile Service Fabric apps. What are the tools profiling CPU, RAM, etc.? Todd, any guidance on that?
Just what you would normally use.
Normally you normally use in a .NET app, so
yeah.
perf counters, that sort of thing.
Perf counters, profiler, whatever you want to use.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just kind of your standard .NET tools is probably what we would recommend there. Okay, so Lars says he's building a multi-tenant data processing pipeline, several different types of independent steps we can configured by a customer. Each actor service instance takes about 50 megabytes of RAM by default without doing anything in it, and it's a huge cost overhead on the VM. So do we have any plans to alleviate that memory cost, adding multiple actor types? So each actor type you add is a separate service type, so you're essentially launching a separate service, and so there's a little bit of overhead associated with that. So we're of course always looking at optimizing these things to improve performance and reduce memory overhead. What I would suggest though is if you do end up with a lot of different actor types, since those do get launched as separate service types, if you have a way of collapsing those back down into fewer number of actor types, that can obviously help. But we'll take a closer look at that memory overhead for you though too, because that does seem pretty high.
Yeah. So can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. You can. Yeah.
Okay, awesome, thanks. The thing with actors is they're supposed to be these granular, tiny units of compute. Yeah. If I collapse them into smaller numbers of actor types, I had a conversation with somebody on the help site a couple months back where the statement was that it's, and maybe it was Mark, I don't know, that it's really not a recommended practice to have multiple types of actor classes in a single service.
Well, that's the thing is, so it's a little trick that we do, which is kind of weird. if you put multiple actor types in the same Visual Studio project, so it kind of looks like they're in the same service, we actually do a little trick. When you compile it, we separate those out into completely different service types, which means they're completely separate services. So the rule is you can actually only have one actor type per service type. So when you launch a service, an actor service, that is a stateful service that represents one actor type. And yes, you're right that an actor is supposed to be a small granular thing, and it is, but we're talking about actor instances there. So each individual actor you activate, that thing doesn't take up 50 megabytes. Right? It's the service itself. And one service, even though it can only contain one type of actor, and the type means you write a class called actor that derives from iActor. That's your actor type. It's basically that class that you write. So it does some functions. When you go and instantiate a bunch of those actors inside of a service, that's the small granular piece. And one service should be able to contain thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of those things, and they're supposed to be pretty small. But when you introduce a new class that derives from iActor, that's a new actor type which gets launched as a completely new service, and that service does have a little bit of overhead associated with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a separate process. That's going to be its own copy. It's going to load up all the DLLs separately. There's a whole copy of the CLR in there.
Exactly.
Well, that's the place where I'm having the trouble, is that most of this, I'm working on two different service fabric systems now, and they both have this kind of a concept of having multiple different types of actors in the system. How do I deal with the fact that drives up my memory utilization? Is there any way to share, a copy of the CLR across multiple actor types? Anything like that in the works?
No, I mean they're physically different processes on the machine, so they're different executables.
Right.
So they're not even loaded into the same, the same address space.
Right. I mean that's what I see in Task Manager. But is there any guidance beyond just reducing the granularity at which I can maintain and upgrade the processes individually?
No, I mean the best thing you can do is you can look at the different actor types that you have and see if you can collapse them down into a fewer number of actor types. Basically sharing functionality between them. And I mean it has additional benefits in collapsing them. If you have a large number of actor types, you end up with a lot more network I/O hopping back and forth between the two, which means a lot more overhead for CPU also because you're doing a lot more serialization. So actually, the more you can collapse them, the better off you'll probably be. So that's what I would look into first if you're running into capacity problems.
Okay, I think I just needed to hear that from somebody. So thank you.
Definitely. Yeah.
I think the next one is about packaging inside applications, and I think Carol's been answering a lot of it.
Yep.
Outside of the thread, in terms of how you package applications differently, whoever's looking at it, if there's a way, if there's more questions that need to be answered there, post them.
Oh, is that mine?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I think I'm thinking about it correctly, but again, I just want to sort of vet it from you guys before we start building multiple copies of this. But so if you want to reuse microservices within other applications, creating a new solution file. One thing that I noticed is that when you right-click on a Service Fabric application, you can add a new microservice, but there doesn't seem to be an option to add an existing microservice. Let me give you the real-world example of, again, we're just trying to create a caching server. Instead of doing a Redis implementation, we're doing Service Fabric. And I may deploy multiple different types of cache. And the way I'm seeing that is I would have an application of a reference data 1 type of cache that I need to have access to, and another reference data 2. I would want that in a different Service Fabric instance of an application, I would think. I don't want them to share the same because if I need to, for some reason, clear one, bring one down, I don't want to bring all of the cache down for all of the applications. So if I was going to repackage and try to reuse the caching code, which is just key value pair kind of stuff, right? I'd want to reuse the existing microservice and then just put it into a new application solution and application project. Is that a good way to do it?
I see. So there's two things. One is on the tooling side, on the Visual Studio side, you can bring in a new service project into an existing application, but that assumes you have the source code and you want to compile it along with the application. But that's a little bit different than I think what you're trying to do. So it sounds like what you want to do is you want to include an already existing caching service in with an application. Is that right? And you want them to kind of be individually manageable. So you can take
so I have
service.
like security permissions in one caching area, and then I have this other reference data in another caching area. And now this cache is exposed outside of the service cluster for my web applications to call and get the information from. 5 different web applications could use these different caching servers. So I don't want to go ahead and create a ton of duplicate caching code of my stateful service and put it in every application type. Does that make sense?
Do you have multiple? So your different caching types, are they actually different code bases that represent those, or is it one cache with some parameter tweaks?
It's the exact same code. It's the same microservice. It's just that, if I want to go and redeploy that code for some reason, I don't want to have to redeploy and clear all of it. I just want to have the ability to deploy this one particular cache type. Does that make sense?
So it sounds to me like you should treat that cache as its own application. And
exactly.
Yeah, so you just have that as a separate application. And then you can create multiple instances of the application in your cluster, and you can give each instance different parameters. So depending on who's using the cache, you can parameterize it a little bit differently for everyone. So that's something you can do. You basically write the cache service, you put it in its own application, you register it in the cluster. That's that registration or provisioning step, which just tells the cluster that, hey, this now exists and it has this version, but nothing's running yet. And then as many times as you want after that, you can create more instances of it, or you just create instances of it, right? So kind of like you define
instances of the service type, right?
Yeah, so you can do it per service. You can also do it per service type. But that requires that you include it as a service type within the application. It's probably a little bit easier to manage if you do it as a separate application.
Yeah, my concern about doing instances is I have a web API endpoint that's exposing it, right? And I have to tell it the type that I'm connecting to when I'm exposing that. So I need the application type name to change so I can reach these specific caches based upon the calls from the web applications that are not Service Fabric applications. Is that correct?
If it's the same code base for all your different caches, then the web service shouldn't need to know the type name, because the type name will be the same for all of them. What you need to give it is the instance name. So when you create an instance of it, when you have this cache type, and I know we're short on time, but if you have a cache app type, so this defines just the type name of the application. That's not what you would give the web service, I don't think. What you do is you create an instance of it, and that's the thing that's called Fabric. This is the name you give it, Fabric / cache app. And then the service name, you can actually put whatever you want in here. So you could even define the type of cache. So maybe this is
I can only call that web app, that Fabric Cache web app, if I am calling from inside of Service Fabric. I'm calling from an externally exposed, I've got a static endpoint, IP port endpoint. So I can't use Fabric Cache as the name. I need IP and port. So I was thinking, instead of having just one cache app type, I would need a security cache type, a reference.
On that client that's outside the cluster, can it be modified at all? Can it be made to understand anything about Service Fabric? Could it hit a random other HTTP endpoint?
I can point it anywhere I want to.
Sure.
My understanding on how to expose it is through the web API ON, endpoint.
So but you could resolve that service using the name. So you tell the client, this client needs to connect to Fabric Cache App Service Cache. We do expose our service resolution APIs over HTTP. So you can hit that HTTP endpoint and get back an address, which is an IP port.
Okay.
And then go from there.
Yeah, so you're saying the naming service can be exposed outside of Service Fabric? Is that what it is, the naming service?
Well, you can. The other way to do it too is when you have your web API as your front end, and then your client's out here.
Mm-hmm.
And your client wants to hit this cache, one of the many caches back here, is that right?
Correct. That is correct.
Have one or two, something like this. Okay. So each of these caches here, they have a name, because these are application instances, right? So they do have specific names.
Correct.
So this will be the app, and then you give it a name here, like cache 1, and then this will be cache 2, for example. Okay. Now, what your client does is when it sends a request here, it says, I want cache 1. So it says, please give me cache 1. The web API takes that and then constructs the service name out of that and says, oh, well, he wants cache 1. So I'm going to do service resolution on cache 1, figure out where that is, forward the request here, because I know the name is here, and then come back to the client. You see what I mean? And so if he wants cache 2, he just specifies that somewhere in a URL parameter or path or something. And then again, Web API just takes that name, finds the cache that's associated with that name, and sends a request there, or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're looking at. My question is, so cache 1 and cache 2 currently is just one project inside of Visual Studio, and the Web API is one project inside of Visual Studio.
Okay.
So if I want to create, inside of Visual Studio in TFS structure, if I want to create a second application that reuses the code I've written for cache 1, would I do a new application type, a new application, and then just include the existing Web API and cache projects? That's sort of my question.
Yeah, you don't have to go back to Visual Studio to do that. You can simply just take the application. You could take the application package. That's the output of your build. And specify. Well, you could even in the cluster, you could just create a new instance of the type that's already in the cluster.
It's just new Service Fabric application or new Service Fabric service or what you're looking for.
Right. So I mean, in Visual Studio, this would be one project. This would be only one project.
Okay.
And then in Service Fabric, you register this on the cluster, right? So you do this registration. And then in order to get 2 of them, you call this create new application command, which is just a Service Fabric command. You call this, and you just give it this name, and you can do that twice. So now you have 2 of these things.
Great.
Yeah, you have 2 instances of these using the same code that you wrote. So these actually are the same code representing that application you did in Visual Studio.
The only update I'd have to do in my instance, because I'm calling it externally, is open up a new port on the Web API to say if, this port represents this name.
Well, it doesn't even have to be a port. This could all be over port 80. What your Web API would do is it would just have some code you would write that would look at the incoming request. So, the request that comes in is HTTP your site.com, and then in the path here will be C1 is the cache I want to go to. So you just parse that out and then find the one you want to send it to.
Awesome.
Yeah, we actually have, if you go look at our Azure samples up on GitHub, if you look at the IoT sample, look for the Service Fabric IoT sample. It actually does something very, very similar to this. You can actually get that. It's a multi-tenant thing, but we basically, instead of caches, we have tenant applications, and the tenant applications are named, like this, with the tenant name in the application name, and then there's a Web API in front of it that does exactly what I just described, where it looks at the incoming request, figures out who to send the request to, and then forwards it to the right one. And it's only one code base. We just create multiple instances of them on the fly to represent each new tenant that comes in. Yeah. So that's
cleaner.
So
Awesome. Thank you.
Small follow-up: when you need to upgrade, when you upgrade the source code and you want to roll that out, if you have multiple application instances, you would need to upgrade each of them, right?
Right.
Yes. If they're application instances, when you do upgrades, you would target each cache application individually for the upgrade. Because an upgrade, when you do a rolling upgrade, the target of the upgrade is an application instance. So you point it at one instance and say, upgrade this one now. So if you have 5 instances, you have to go upgrade 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. Yeah.
But so if you have the caches as different service instances within the same application,
yes,
you would only have to upgrade that one application instance.
Yeah, you got to pick your poison, right? You got to either have the flexibility of upgrading individuals, or or you're going to see that you impact more than one application at a time, or whatever.
Right. And that's up to you, however you want to handle that. Either way.
Okay. Alrighty, thank you.
Yep. I think I have time for a few final questions here. Looks like people are dropping off anyway. There's a question here that says, stateless service shutdown is cooperative, which allows the running service to shut down cleanly. Is it achievable with Windows containers in Service Fabric? So I think there's 2 things here. One is, when you call close on a stateless service, we call close on you cleanly in terms of you have the cancellation token on run async gets called. In the 5.4 release that gets posted, you won't be able to actually, that comes out, the first version of containers, you won't actually be able to run Service Fabric stateless services in them yet. You can only do them as guest containers. So what that means is that when you shut down the container, it will shut down just your code that's running within inside there. When we have stateless service supporting inside that, you'll of course get the notification that you do normally. The only thing with the containers now is that there's a generally with any service there's a deactivation period, so that right now there's a default period that when you shut down the container, you can control how long it takes until the container just gets shut down. It could be, and I think by default right now it's about a minute. So you can change that time if you need to do some cleanup, but there isn't any notification that will get sent to you about that, unless there's something from the Docker engine, actually, so I'll have to check on that. Yeah, if the notification gets sent from Docker engine that gets shutting down, then we might be able to hook into that. I'll have to look into that. That's a good point. I'll get back to you on that one.
Thanks.
Yeah, do you know if Docker engine has a notification of it's being shut down?
I've been looking at it. Apparently, it sends a SIG term in Linux, but I couldn't find anything which had similar stuff for Windows.
Yeah. Actually,
so
that's
we
a good
tried.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll look into that. We're just trying to make a lot of things work well in Docker at the moment. For example, it has a very tough time with telling. When you call a Docker engine at the moment, everything it succeeds, and then you have to go back and call on this stream to get hold of all the things that failed inside it all, and it's kind of a very, very difficult way of figuring out what went wrong with things inside there. So we're trying to make errors come out nicer, because Docker is a pretty difficult API for returning errors. If it has some way of having a notification inside there, it has this quite awkward API to use. We'll find that out. And it makes sense to have a way of having a notification to say your container's being shut down. So good ask.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, we're quarter over. Do we have a few more that want to go through?
Yeah, I lost one last
question.
You guys want to just do it?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
I think that's about it, isn't it? We have.
Yeah, actually, I think we're at the end here.
Will the recording be made available? Yes, absolutely. We will post that.
I tossed one in right at the end there.
Which one? Any queries about how there are any solution features built into Service Fabric within the cluster for Docker containers?
Oh, isolation features.
No, this is not isolation.
Well, it says Docker containers, it's not isolation.
Yeah, he says, curious to know if there are any isolation features built into Service Fabric within a cluster. Of course, Docker containers does not equal isolation.
Oh,
higher isolation than containers? I think the answer is no.
No, that's enough.
Well, I mean, Windows is going to have two types of containers. They have Windows containers, which are shared kernel, and then there's hypervisor containers, which is they have a kernel within inside the container itself. So when they have hypervisor containers, they're fully isolated between the containers, each with their own kernel. That makes them more secure. Of course, they're closer. They're more expensive to start, but that's where that direction is going on Windows.
And you can always use placement constraints to make sure that two services that you never want to be on the same node never run on the same node. That's another thing you can do. It generally requires, the more placement constraints like that you have, that requires more nodes in the cluster, because now you need more VM node types. But you can separate things out by, actual hardware. So you can say service 1 always runs on node type A, and service 2 only runs on node type B, and the two will never meet. That's another thing you can do.
The general assumption is that your service fabric cluster is not appropriate for hostile multi-tenant.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Hypervisor containers are the only way to eventually do that, which is not here yet.
Great. All right.
There was a question about follow-up where I posted about resolution. You can call the naming service over REST. So if you have a container that you want to have code inside it that you want to register with our naming service, you can call that over REST and get hold of endpoints and other containers or other processes that are running. So you don't actually have to have Service Fabric runtime running in them. So effectively, you can have a Java app or a JavaScript app call onto the naming service over REST to get back the names of the other services it wants to communicate with. We'll post a sample of this when we post our 5.4 release at the end of this month.
And then Gary's just got a quick follow-up to the API management question. How would you do something similar without actually using API management? So of course, we always say you can always write your own gateway application, your gateway service, which is stateless and does the kind of URL routing you want. The other option that you mentioned was Azure Application Gateway. That's definitely something you can try as well, which it doesn't know anything about Service Fabric services, the same way API management doesn't know anything about it currently, and the same way the load balancer doesn't. So you'd still need either the reverse proxy to do your service call routing, or your own stateless service to act as a gateway to do that routing. So you can always write your own, or you can check out Application Gateway, but in that case, you would still have a reverse proxy behind it. So a couple options you can explore there. Agreed, API management. API management is a bit expensive as a starter. Yeah, it's a bit costly, but it is also very feature rich, so there's a lot of stuff you get with that. If all you need is just routing, you can look at other reverse proxies that do URL routing, or again, just write a simple stateless service of your own that does it based on Web API or something like that.
And then there was a last question around backup, and on data loss is a little bit of a kludge and doesn't seem like maybe the right place for things, and it's hard to test. And honestly, yes, and the things that you have described there are all true. And also the implementation that you described seems to be what you normally have to do. We are aware that that code's a little hard to write, and yet it is very important. There are some things where we're planning on integrate with Azure Backup to help make kind of automated and scheduled backups a little bit easier, but that is not going to alleviate much around the code that you have to write in that method. So today, what you've got there sounds about right, and that is what you have to do. And we're aware that it's hard. We're looking into some things we might be able to do to make that code easier, but we don't have anything really planned at this point. So what you seem to have there sounds good.
Cool. I think that's it.
I think that's the end.
Okay.
All right.
So we've got one scheduled for next month, right?
What's the date of the next one?
Anybody have it handy?
It's in December.
Close to Christmas, probably.
Well, it gets to the next one.
If people think these are good, we can make them an hour and a half in future. If you think that you want us to...
We did.
We did, I guess.
Intentionally do it, yeah.
I just spend so much time drawing on the Surface stuff. It's fun.
Yeah.
Hope this new format's useful for you guys.
The next one is on December the 15th, Thursday, December the 15th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time again.
Great.
So what we're thinking about doing in the new year is moving to a regular cadence so that you would know that, say, it's always the first Thursday of the month or something like that, so that you don't necessarily have to stay on top of the blog and Twitter. And so December 15th will be the next one, but then after that, we'll try to get into regular rhythm.
Cool. Okay. All right.
Visual is awesome.
Yeah, I agree. Surface subs are awesome.
Got a pen.
That is fun.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we should keep doing it this way.
Okay.
Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
If you guys have any interest, I'm available pretty much any time to come hang out and show you guys